It was the final battle and major offensive in Europe during World War II, but the Battle of Berlin was incredibly deadly, and the toll on soldiers and civilian life was huge. Inside of his Führer bunker, deep underground, below the Reich Chancellery, the governmental headquarters, the ailing Führer of Nazi Germany was giving his final orders. He had made his mind up. For him, there was no way out of his capital, and he decided not to abandon the Reich, his empire and people, choosing to die amongst them in the final throes of a war that he had caused. Adolf Hitler was one of the 125,000 German people inside of Berlin, mostly civilians, who would perish inside of the city. He would take the easy way out, choosing a cyanide capsule that he did to begin with distrust, but he was intent on ordering his forces to defend the city. The Battle of Berlin was colossal in its historical impact and the effect, and in the death toll and pain that was inflicted upon the city. But one thing which is often not spoken about is the clean-up around the German capital in the days after the fighting. There were bodies lying all over the streets, civilians and soldiers had not been buried, and one question does remain about the legacy of that final battle in Europe. What happened to the bodies after the Battle of Berlin? Let's look at this, shall we? And please do make sure you are subscribed. It was on the 2nd of May 1945 that the artillery guns of the Soviet Red Army stopped firing upon Berlin. For a matter of weeks, thousands of shells and bullets had rained down on the capital of the Third Reich, intent on causing devastation and death, and inflicting vengeance upon the heart of the Reich. Some Soviet veterans claimed that the silence that came immediately after the fighting had come to an end was deafening, and also incredibly eerie. In less than 4 years since Hitler had sprung his attack on the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, his dream of a 1,000-year Reich lay in ruins, and his city had been destroyed. Hitler himself was also dead. He succumbed to his own fate by his own hand on the 30th of April 1945 within the confines of his study inside of the Führer bunker, sitting next to his wife of around 40 hours, Eva Hitler, or Eva Braun, as she is more famously known. The fighting around the city and inside of it was brutal and incredibly rough. Streets became war zones, and every house and structure mattered for the advancing Soviet Red Army. Because of the damage from artillery shells, many residential areas and important buildings were levelled to the ground, or were in complete ruins, ruins of their former self. And of course, with every piece of artillery that crashed onto Berlin, there was a huge risk to life. The city before the battle had been struck for some years by relentless bombing raids, which were undertaken by the British and also American warplanes, who dropped their payload onto the capital. The people of Berlin were used to the bombs, but not on the scale that the Soviets brought. One woman who witnessed this claimed, and I quote, "Shots shattered our windows and shells exploded in our garden, and suddenly the Soviets were on our street. Shaken by the battle around us and numb with fear, we watched from behind the small cellar window, facing the street as the tanks and an endless convoy of troops rolled by." It was a terrifying sight as they sat high upon their tanks with their rifles cocked, aiming at houses as they passed. The screaming, gun-wielding women were the worst. Half of the troops had only rags and tatters around their feet, while others wore SS boots that had been looted from a conquered SS barracks in Lichterfelde. Several fleeing people had told us earlier that they kept watching different boots pass by their cellar windows. The Soviets at the end of the battle claimed that they had captured around 480,000 German soldiers, but many of these were members of the Volkssturm, the civilian army, who were ordered to lay down their life for the defence of the city. This estimate is rather high, but German research places the number of dead German soldiers between 92,000 and 100,000, and it is considered that around 125,000 civilians were killed during the battle for the city. There were large-scale reports of assault by Soviet soldiers upon women, with many of these victims being killed after their harrowing ordeals, but there was also reports of murder, killing of unarmed civilians in war crimes, and pure vengeance killings. For the Soviets, they'd seen how the German army had treated many people in their invasion of the Soviet Union, and they wanted some payback. As was expected, many of the dead and deceased people of Berlin, military or civilian, lay in the places where they fell. It was said in the area around the Reich Chancery, where Hitler had been holed up, that the fighting was incredibly ferocious and that bodies lay strewn all over the streets. The bodies were in too dangerous territory and positions for family members to try and clean up the remains and to deal with them whilst the battle was going on, so some were left for some days in the open, rotting and decomposing. The military did try to claim and deal with their dead when they could. The German soldiers were subjected to differing fates with regards to their own burials. Some were placed inside of mass graves close to where large groups of people had died, literal holes in the ground in the middle of the streets. It's believed that this is why the remains of famous Nazis such as Hermann Fegelein, Heinrich Himmler's liaison to the Führerbunker, and Hitler's somewhat brother-in-law, has never had his body found. He was shot inside the Reich Chancery garden and presumably was never identified, with his body just being thrown in a nearby mass grave along with civilians and soldiers. German soldiers who did die in the defence of the city were interred inside of small cemeteries scattered all around Berlin. For example, the Lilienthal-Strasse German War Cemetery houses the corpses of 4,935 soldiers and civilians, but there are smaller sites, such as inside the old military cemetery, the Invalidenfriedhof, that holds a mass grave dating back to the battle. Some German soldiers were buried slightly out of Berlin in a cemetery in the Halbe forest as they were fighting the advancing Soviets who were heading towards Berlin. Still today the bodies are being discovered in the region of Berlin and inside the city. Groups of local Germans were the ones who cleaned up the bodies and remains and buried them mostly. Inside of Berlin in 1997, a large number of bones, presumably of German soldiers or civilians, were found during construction at Potsdamer Platz and near to the central railway station. It is known that during the battle that this area saw intense fighting, and the remains were of those who fought in this. As further building projects take place in Berlin, the past continues to remind those who dig as mass graves are discovered. It is relatively difficult to identify the remains too, unless they do have dog tags, but many of the defenders of the city were, as mentioned, civilians who were ordered to fight, given whatever weapons they could get their hands on, and these were not given any dog tags. Following the carving up of the city post-war, and also with the construction of the Berlin Wall, it's not known what happened when the Soviets found German war graves in East Berlin, and what they did with the bodies. Soviet soldiers who were attacking the city were often also buried where they fell in battle, as cleanup squads would deal with the remains when there was a lull in fighting. Some bodies were collected and buried in mass graves, and there are memorials that mark these sites in the Tiergarten, at Treptower Park, and also at Schönholzer Heide. The grave at Treptower Park, it's believed, houses around 7,000 Soviet corpses, and the Tiergarten grave contains around 2,500. But at Schönholzer Heide, around 13,200 corpses were buried. But there were still roughly 60,000 Soviet soldiers' bodies who were buried in unmarked sites all across the city. The bodies of civilians who died being caught up in the fighting have been much trickier to locate. German non-combatants are buried in 170 cemeteries across Berlin and in the surrounding regions, but many of these were also those who died inside of concentration camps and who died at the end of the war under Soviet occupation. These cemeteries contain around 150,000 bodies, but it is impossible to know how many of these died during the battle. Many following death, if they were found by family members, were buried very quickly and inside of small plots, even in parks or gardens or green spaces, ready for a proper burial later. But this would not come around. Like mentioned earlier, bodies are still being found and located all across Berlin, and each year people who got caught up in the battle are discovered. If a body dating back to the battle is found today, then they are buried inside of the cemeteries in the city, being given a proper burial once and for all. Many people remain missing still to this day, and there are a number of memorials all around the city to act as honorary cemeteries for the forever missing. Some who visited Berlin in the days after the fighting had ended described it as a giant cemetery, and there was a lack of working people to help clear up and bury the remains, and there was also a lack of wood to create coffins. It was said of the burials in the immediate aftermath that they took place in chaotic places, city parks, anti-tank ditches, public squares, and even at the side of roads. Still today, thousands of soldiers, German or Soviet, and thousands of civilians lay under the ground inside of Berlin, their stories dating back to 1945, waiting to be untold and uncovered. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please do make sure to subscribe, it really does help. And once again, thank you so much for watching.